Hi, everybody. Who's ready for this right now? Cheers. So I don't know what everyone has. Please feel free to share because I know with this Vine stuff, I'm super excited, and I hope you guys are as much as I am that this whole like kind of series thing. But it does leave it very open for flexibility. So I've got my lovely from the organic cellar Muscadet Sevret Maine, uh, Grand Reserve Sur Lee Grand Reserve. Those of you who are with me in the Loire are familiar with that one. But beyond that, I am just so happy to have everyone here. And like I was just saying, I am really, really excited, and I hope you guys are as excited as I am to kind of dig into this stuff a little bit more, which I think is really, really fun. I'm just very, very excited to do that with you. So hi, you guys. Life cycle of a vine. Starting out with this, I think is what I think is so exciting about this is that it's literally this is everything that makes our wine, and it's kind of an amazing thing that there's so much more that goes into it that people don't necessarily have the there's just a lot around it, right? And I think there's so many of us, like the first time that I ever saw a vineyard, it was way, way, way later in life, right? I started drinking wine, I started appreciating wine, I started learning about wine, but actually going into the vineyard and starting to see these individual cycles and what they mean and how it affects the whole growth of the wine that we drink, where it begins, and how important it is to know that every step of the way, like there's never really a passive time in a vineyard, right? There's always just constantly something going on. So what we're starting off with is this idea that all of the wine, or generally almost all of the wine that we drink, comes from a specific genus of vine called Vitis. Vitis, and then the family, or the vine that it comes from, is Vitis vinifera. Sorry, the species of vine is called Vitis vinifera. And so this is a vine that is native to the European continent, for example. We've talked about that before, where it's like, yes, America has its own, we have our own vines, obviously. Those vines have created rootstock that make it possible for the Vitis vinifera vine to actually flourish in spite of phylloxera. But the reality is that the most of the wine we drink comes from this European vine. And this vine itself, what makes it one of the most amazing things about it is that it is actually hermaphroditic. So what that means is that this grapevine that we get the grapes from to make our wine is able to pollinate itself. Now this makes it, besides being a vine and the fact that a vine has extremely tolerable life growing capabilities, right? You don't need a whole lot to grow a vine. It's very interesting. We actually just planted some passion fruit vines over here in my home, but it's kind of the same thing where your soils, all of the things that we'll talk about too throughout this month, but it doesn't need a lot to thrive. And this just makes it even more incredibly versatile. So way, way back when, too, this vine actually used to have a male and a female part, and it did need to be pollinated. But over time, in evolution in nature, it naturally developed these self-pollinating versions of itself. And then too, when the Romans began to start cultivating the vine and actually trying to create that and domesticate it, if you will, obviously they're going to pick the vines that are much more easy, much easier, that are that are able to do it all on their own, because that just makes grape growing so much easier. So another important factor is, of course, that knowing that these vines that we use don't always produce fruit right away. So it is an interesting situation. For example, if you are interested, for example, in becoming a winemaker, and you buy a piece of property and you want to plant a vineyard from scratch, there's a few things you need to know. One is that you are looking at minimum 5 years before you have even a vintage to make wine from. Basically, up until that point, the vine needs time to grow. It needs time to understand itself. It's in its adolescence. Oftentimes, these grapevines won't even start producing fruit until year 3. And then even then, those kinds of, if you can even make wine from those grapes at that point, it's still a couple of years before a winemaker is actually going to use any of that youthful wine in production. And in that too, it's important to know that those wines are never going to be the creme de la creme of whatever they're making. The older the vine, obviously, the more concentrated the fruit, the more mature, just the better, right? Everything gets better with age when it comes to to grapes and grapevines and wine. But the reality is that there is a very, very long startup point to those vines producing fruit. The other thing is that it's really interesting too to know that when you have a particular wine that you really like, or there is a particularly high quality wine, that it is being made from a specific vine. And if you want to replicate that, or if you want to make more of that wine, you are going to need to plant a cutting of that vine. You don't plant seeds necessarily. You don't plant seeds ever. Even when you're planting a new vineyard, you plant cuttings. So you go in there and you take a clipping off of the vine that you like, or the clone that you'd like to use, or you go and you get that from a nursery where it's already been started for you, if you will, but they're always started from a vine, an existing vine, because vines are just like people. If you try and grow them from seed, no two seeds are actually alike. Just like children are not going to be identical clones of your parent, neither are the seeds of the grapes going to produce the same grape even, much less the same kind of wine or the same potential of the grape that you'd like to produce. So new vineyards are always created with cuttings, as are any sort of changes in the vineyards of what you're looking for. And it's also interesting to know that this vine, while it starts usually around years 5 or so, you start to produce your wine. Usually they say as it gets older, it starts to produce less fruit. That fruit does get more concentrated and more energy goes into creating those berries. But as when you start to get into 30 years or so, we're looking at old vines. It's not an official term because there is no official term, or there's no official regulation, I should say, for what old vine means. But generally speaking, a lot of times we're talking about 30 plus years. At that point, production starts to dramatically decline in terms of the amount of fruit that you get from a vine. And also the concentration of that fruit begins to heighten and develop as well, which means that you're looking at a much different wine made from old vine fruit versus from new vine fruit. There's going to be different textural qualities, different intensity of flavor and aroma, all of those things based on the age. And vines can live a darn long time. Usually if they get grubbed up or pulled up, it's because they're not producing enough to make them economically viable. But smart producers will know how to manage and keep their old vines happy so that they can make those kind of beautiful, rich wines that you can get from that. Now, when we're talking about the grapevine vitis vinifera, we want to talk about the parts of the vine, and that makes an important part. So basically there's green parts and there's wood parts. The roots make up a very, very important part of the wood part. And this is all the surface of underground part that the vine exists as. So you're looking at, this is where the roots all dig into the ground to search for water and for nutrients. It's vital to have a healthy root system. The deeper it goes, generally speaking, the better the quality of that grape you're going to have, which means, of course, the better the wine you're going to ultimately get. So when you're looking at the health of a vine for wine, you want to know that it's having a really, really hearty, healthy root system that's going really, really deep. That makes it really, really strong and makes it really, really also kind of drought tolerable. It makes it more available to find more water when it needs it, the little that it does need. Then we have our trunk. So in the vineyard, you're always going to see there's a woody part, just like a tree, that comes out from the roots. It grows up. This is starts off as just a little tiny branch, right? But eventually this grows into a thicker, more substantial trunk that is the conduit for all of the water and nutrients that are being pulled up into the vine, and that's eventually going to go out into the rest of the plant itself, including into the canes. So this is an interesting part. And when we get to the end of the month, we're going to start talking a little bit more about the idea of training a vine. Originally, too, when the Romans were planting, they didn't have trellises, they didn't have systems like that. They would just plant a vine, and they would actually take the end of the vine and stick it into the ground next to it to create another vine when they wanted more wine. They didn't go through all the cutting and the planting and that kind of thing. But essentially, we have a very more meticulous system these days that allow for better handling of the fruit and better health in the vineyard. So one of the things that we do is we trellis vines, and we do that by kind of manipulating what are called the canes. So essentially these are the growths that come off of the trunk of the vine. Now canes, in this particular picture, we're looking at a very traditional idea of what a grapevine looks like, usually either 1 or 2 arms sticking out of the trunk. Now when those arms are initially just grown, that year, when it's a new arm, it's called a cane. You might keep that cane if you're a winemaker for many, many years. It will start to develop as a bigger kind of piece of wood that you get new canes and shoots coming off of. When it's a thicker piece, when it's a thicker arm, it's called a cordon. And those don't ever change or move. But again, we're going to go into this more when we talk a little bit about training systems at the end of the month. For today's purposes, the idea is that a cane is a thicker, more substantial part, but still is flexible, that comes off the trunk of the vine itself. Now, the next part that we have is, of course, the shoots. And now is when we're starting to get into the green part. So we've been talking a lot about the wood. The shoots are essentially this sort of, they start off very, very tiny, but these are the things that grow and extend upward and outward and essentially create the, are the host of the foliage, which is our leaves, the foliage, the green parts, and the little tendrils that come off the side of it, right? So the leaves are probably one of the most important parts of the entire vine system because these are your solar panels. The leaves are what collect the sunlight in order to make photosynthesis possible, which is how the plant creates the sugars to put into the grapes to eventually become the wine. So the shoots are part of that whole foliage system, and the foliage itself are those green solar panel leaves that we see. And then finally, last but not least, of course, we have our fruit. Generally speaking, like I said, when we're looking at sort of what was called vertical shoot positioning, that's one of our training systems, it's pretty easy to spot. The fruit usually hangs down below the vine because it's made to do that. But we all pretty much know what the fruit is. It is the grapes, the delicious parts that make the wine itself, that house the juice and, you know, the good stuff. So now we're going to get into our beautiful little life cycle of a vine, because literally at every point of the year, there's something important going on. And interestingly enough, winter is one of the most critical times and one of the busiest times in a vineyard. It can be, because there's something called winter pruning. And winter pruning is essentially the time between, it usually starts after Christmas, definitely. Usually not until the new year, probably around January. I should stop right now and just mention that when I'm going to refer to these dates and these months right now, I'm going to be referring to the Northern Hemisphere. So it's good to know the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere are opposite. And that includes the life cycle of the vine. So whenever I say winter, it's still winter. It's summer in the Southern Hemisphere, when it's winter in the Northern Hemisphere. So if you add or subtract 6 months, you'll have the dates for the Southern Hemisphere in general, just as a good note, as a reminder. But for winter pruning in the Northern Hemisphere, this usually begins at the start of the year. There's a historical date called of January 22nd is actually the feast of the patron saint of wine growing, Saint Vincent, is on January 22nd, and this was traditionally considered a really good day to, you know, start tending your vineyard. But the reality is, in today's day and age, it's really about getting this done as efficiently as possible so that everything is taken care of by the time you get to the next phase of the vine. So in the wintertime, the vines are dormant. They're not producing any sugars, they're not growing. What you have is all of these sort of sticks that are attached to the trunk that are from last year's harvest. Everything is no longer, it's just not active, it's not alive. It is just dormant, it's sleeping. So it is alive, but it's just dormant. At this point, this is when it's a critical moment that the right canes are chosen for the next year's vintage and crop. And usually, if you, in the last picture, when we looked at that, there's, in this particular case, you've got essentially all the other sticks, all the other branches are being cut down, and they're saving, for example, 2 canes that they're going to then bend over and attach to the trellis in this particular system. And it's from these canes that you're going to get all the rest of your fruit. So the critical part of this is that you want to pick the right canes. There'll usually be a couple extra sometimes, because you want to have a backup in case the one cane you choose decides to get sick or ill or during the process. But there's a lot of excess wood that is removed at this point. This winter pruning does a lot of things. It determines the yields for next year's crops. It's one of the most expensive and one of the most important activities in the vineyard because it takes a really long time. You need manpower to go through, and you need to do this. And considering the size of your vineyard, for example, you have to go individually and address each vine on its own, which does obviously take time. It's very important to take that time to do that right. So when we get into our next phase is bud break. So, you know, we're in January, February, and all of a sudden, and even March is when we're doing all of this winter pruning, depending on the season, on what the climate's like where you are. And then we get to bud break, and this is the beautiful part, right? This is where the green starts to come out. You have these little bitty bitty buds that start to come out of the canes. You have the just sprouting that eventually comes into the leaves. You know, you get the greenage that's coming out. And just before this happens, the cut end of the canes start to produce sap. The weather's getting warmer, and when it saps, when it starts to essentially bleed, that's when you know that the juices are starting to flow. The vine itself is waking up, and it's getting ready to start photosynthesizing. So you see this, you see the little winter buds emerge from the canes themselves, and then the shoots start to grow. What is so very critical at this time, if you're noticing in the Northern Hemisphere, this is April, May, right about. So depending on where you are, this can be a tricky time of year when it comes to frost. Frost is nobody's friend in the vineyard. So a lot of things can be done to help protect against this. You might do some smudging. There might be some, you know, heat. There might be ways. There are different various ways that vignerons and vineyard people tending the vineyards will address and prevent frost in a very extreme circumstance. For example, if you are, you know, a first growth chateau in Bordeaux, you might hire 6 or 7 helicopters to just twirl in the air for hours at a time and circulate it so that the frost doesn't settle on these vines. But the critical part about that, the reason that's so important, is because these little buds are everything. Everything's going to come from these little green shoots. So if these get frozen off, you're out of luck and you don't have a crop that year. So that is a really important thing to take into account. It's the critical, most dangerous portion of this particular cycle in the life of the vine. Now, after we've started to see that green, the foliage start to come out, then we get to the fun part, right? Which is the flowering, and then something that's called the fruit set. So it all sort of makes quite a lot of sense. This happens simultaneously, but just like anything else, what's going to start happening is you're going to, these self-pollinating vines that we have, right? These are going to start to grow little flowers and little buds. The flowering itself, when the flowers start to occur, this usually happens approximately 13 weeks after bud break. So it's interesting when you notice the cycle, the life cycle of a vine, it's oftentimes very, very regulated in that time frame. So winemakers know when to expect this to happen. And it might be, you know, a day or less, more or less here or there, but ultimately about 13 weeks after you see the first buds is when you're going to start to see the first flowers. This is all very, very dependent on your climate. And so as a winemaker, you're going to be familiar with your climate and you're going to have a better idea of that. Does global warming affect that? Absolutely. And of course, that is changing. Every cycle of the life of the vine can be extended or shortened based on that climatic element that is changing constantly in these days. But essentially what we're looking at in this picture here is something called inflorescence. And this is the structure that becomes the grape bunch itself. So in this particular case, we have got these hard little beads that have come from, the vines have self-pollinated, being hermaphroditic. They create the flowers then fall away, and you start to see these beautiful little like miniature berries. And this is the inflorescence. And this is what will essentially become the grape itself. Now, there's a couple things that can happen here that are really interesting. The particular moment in which that flower is pollinated and the inflorescence starts to happen, the successful pollination is the fruit set. So fruit set is a critical term and a really important part of the life cycle of the vine, because if you don't get fruit set, you don't get fruit. And this can happen it often happens because the reality is there's a lot of flowers. I don't know if anyone has ever grown any kind of berry in their yard, but like I think too about, we have some blueberries, and when they start to, you see all those, there are tons of flowers. There's tons of possible grapes. There's tons of possible berries that can be there. And the reality is only about 30% of those actually become grapes themselves, right? So there's a large portion of the entire, which is natural. That's the natural system. Now, when you start to get less than that for basic reasons, then you start to run into problems with production. But the reason you would run into this particular problem, there's a couple of things that can happen. If you don't get fruit set, it can mean one of two things. One, that you end up with something called the millerandage. Millerandage is the French term for essentially never leaving this phase. You're constantly in this little green berry phase, and it never actually develops into real genuine grape berries, that millerandage. And this happens from nutrient deficiency in the soil. It happens from cloudy weather during the flowering. This is another really important part. This is why we hear a lot about vintage variations in Bordeaux, for example, a maritime climate where you've got lots and lots of cloud cover. You've got lots of weather systems that are really complicated. If you reduce the amount of sunlight that those flowers are getting, that those vines are getting, they might not be able to produce sufficient amount of carbohydrates to actually complete the fruit set process. So if that happens, that may result in millerandage, where you don't have any of these little guys developing into berries. There's also the something else called coulure, which is when berries or the little green, they're just shed after flowering and you don't get any yields. So these things just start to fall off, and then suddenly you're left with fewer grapes, less yield. And while, you know, that does happen naturally to a portion of your crop no matter what, when it starts to become a big problem, then you run out of wine to make, which is never ever the goal. So we're looking again at the fact that this is where, when we're talking about vintage variation, we're talking about weather and how important that is. It's at this phase, the flowering and the fruit set phase. It's at the phase before us, you know, that sort of, that where we're the greenery phase, where we're starting to grow. Not enough access to sunlight is going to have a pretty big damage about that. And that's just life. But sunny, beautiful weather, that's always going to help your fruit. Cloudy weather can be detrimental. So now we're getting into our season, our summer season, which is where we are right now. And this is July and August, the beautiful, beautiful time of veraison. So this is the changing of the color. So during the summer, during veraison, essentially, it's getting hotter, and that's where the climate starts. Also, the vine starts to slow down. It doesn't produce quite as much. It's not going for as much green, you know? So at this point, it starts to focus more of its energy on the fruit. So it's hotter, it's not producing as much sugar, and all of those sugars are going directly into the fruits themselves. So while they've been sort of hard dark green or hard green berries at this point, this is where you start to see the colors shifting. This is obviously more noticeable in red varietals, where you see a definite change in color from green to red. This is still a process that happens. This is sort of the ripening process that still happens with white grapes as well. But the part of this is when you're going to know, as a winemaker, you're going to be walking through there, you're going to start to see some bunches doing really, really well. And you're going to start to see some grape bunches that maybe aren't really looking as healthy. They're not looking as full. They're not looking as, you know, sumptuous as something that you want to make wine out of eventually. And at this point, it's very common and almost necessary to go through and do something called green harvesting. So as some of these bunches are starting to develop, you're starting to see the colors changing, and you're going to choose the best looking bunches to keep. And then you're going to cut away the other bunches. Why would they do this? Why would you just throw fruit on the ground, right? Part of that is because you're wanting to concentrate more flavor, aroma, and intensity into fewer berries, because you want to make the best wine possible, and that is quality, not quantity, right, Dan? That's what I thought. So what you're looking for is to try and create the best quality grapes, and you do that by not keeping grapes that aren't going to do as well, because those will just suck energy out of the vine and take away from the star grapes. So green harvesting at this point helps to maintain yields. It helps to manage the amount of grapes that will eventually be turned into wine. And in some regions, in particular in the old world, this is mandated essentially because you are only allowed to have a certain yield of grapes anyway. So if you're only allowed like 2 tons of grapes and you've got 3 tons of grapes on your vines, you're going to have to get rid of a ton of grapes no matter what. So you might as well get rid of the bad ones first, so that the 2 tons that you keep are going to be the ones that are going to be the best and make the best wine. So whether you get rid of them during green harvesting and allow that process to help make the other grapes better, or whether you're going to dump them when you bring it in from the vineyard at the end, that's up to you. Most people choose the green harvesting at this point to improve the quality and manage yields. So our next, voila, when we get into the fall, we are seeing September, October in the Northern Hemisphere is when we start to see harvest, the beautiful time of harvest, the grape stomping. Has anyone here, I mean, you can just write it in there, but has anyone ever gone to an actual grape stomping and like stomped their feet in there? I have not. I know my mother has. Which is really, really fun and exciting. But this is always like a very celebratory time, right? It's also, man, is it a lot of work, because you have so much that depends on your harvest and so much that you need to care about. But you've got the original idea was that harvest happened 100 days after flowering. This was sort of the traditional marker of the time, that kind of idea that you can regulate the life cycle of a vine and when you're going to see that. This is no longer the case. So like before when I said 13 weeks, in this case, it can be anywhere from 100 days to 145 days, depending on weather, depending on where you are as the climate, depending on, or in the hemisphere. And there's also a lot going on right now, which is that some people, because we have better technology and better understanding of vineyard management, they can actually let their grapes stay on the vine longer, which results in more concentrated fruits, higher fruit levels, sometimes higher alcohol levels, which may or may not be desirable, but in a lot of cases, this does tend to increase the ripeness and may, the reason this is really important, especially now, what we're seeing is that when you're in a cooler climate, which is what Europe usually has historically been represented as, your harvest time is going to be a very tricky time. It might get too cold too fast, and you might have to pick early, which means that you're going to have pretty high acidity in your grapes, and that you might not have as much body or as much tannin or as much alcohol as you'd like. By leaving the grapes on the vines longer, you're allowing them to ripen more, and then you're just getting riper, more concentrated fruit into the winery to make your wine. So the opportunity to make that choice as a winemaker, some of them do, and they'll leave it on much, much longer. But the reality is that harvest is dependent on a lot of things. It's dependent on your weather. Is it raining? Do you have to harvest early because of some sort of inclement weather that could potentially destroy your crop? Is there frost? Are you waiting too long and a frost destroys your crop and you can't take in half of it? Is there some sort of disease problem going on? Do you have enough staff? This is also really important, because if you're a winemaker in a smaller region and you have a host of traveling people who are helping pick, it's a lot of people that are sometimes required. You might have to wait an extra week or two before you can pick your grapes because you just don't have the manpower. The reality is too, is like, maybe you got stuff to do. Maybe you're a winemaker, but you know, it's grandma's birthday and you need to go to grandma's birthday that day, so you're gonna go. The reality is there's a lot of factors that go into when you exactly harvest your grapes. But the truth is that you want to harvest your grapes when they're ready. So you want the sugar ripeness and what's generally called the physiological ripeness, physiological maturity, to be intersected. You want it to ripen at the same time. So everyone kind of knows what sugar ripeness is. It's how much sugar is in the grape itself that eventually goes into and becomes the alcohol in your wine. Physiological ripeness isn't as defined of a term. It's more of a concept of saying, what is the rest of the grape doing? what is the color of the grape? How do the seeds taste? How firm is it? The idea of, are the tannins developed enough? The physiological ripeness is all of those other elements that are not the sugar that do tend to ripen at a different level. Your acidity levels, for example, as your sugar ripeness goes up, your acidity levels will generally go down. So you want to make sure you're picking it at a point where the grape has good sugar ripeness, but doesn't lose the acidity to balance that, to make sure you're going to make ultimately a well-balanced wine. So all of those factors together, and it's monitored. It can happen very quickly. Some grapes are notoriously are just notorious for having very short windows of being able to pick those grapes because your acidity will drop very quickly after a certain point. Some grapes are a little bit more forgiving. It really is just about knowing that. But winemakers and vignerons are constantly testing that. They're constantly testing it using various scientific measures, and they're testing it by just literally eating the grapes and seeing if they feel like they're ready, if they taste ready, and if you know that. As a sort of venerated winemaker, oftentimes they will have that kind of concept very, very strongly intuitive inside of them. So now we've got our harvest. Exactly, I didn't go onto this picture right here. This is someone harvesting. You have options too with harvesting. Hand harvesting is obviously a preferred way to keep your grapes intact. The other option, it's slower, it's more expensive, but you do tend to have more control over the grapes that are coming into the winery. And also you have the stems and sometimes leaves and everything coming in as well, which means that your bunches are whole. So that is going to be important if as a winemaker you want to do a whole cluster fermentation or include partial whole cluster. If you guys have heard of that ever terms before, you can't do that if you use a machine. Now, machine harvesting is also very, very common. It goes through the vineyards, and these giant machines, they shake the vines, they knock all the grapes off very, very quickly, very efficiently. But, you know, in that case, you're going to have all types of grapes, maybe bunches that aren't as ripe or more ripe, or ones that you wouldn't pick if you were picking by hand. You also are going to deal with the fact that there's going to be no stems there, and you have exposed juice and exposed flesh of the grape, which means that you're going to have oxygen getting in there sooner than maybe you want to. So you can, however, machine harvest in the middle of the night, which you really can't do with people. So, and you want to make sure that you're taking all of that into consideration when you choose how you're going to harvest your grapes. So that happens again, September, October. And then once you've harvested, you have got those grapes inside the winery, and that is when you are going to start vinification. So vinification is the making of the wine. At this point, the vineyard is really left alone. You have some grapes that are still in there. You've got now these beautiful changing of the colors though too, right? Because all of those leaves are now turning into just like any sort of deciduous plant, and they will fall. And then eventually what will happen is that the vines will stop producing sugars. They'll start to go into that dormant state and bring us right back around to the beginning of the year again. So during this time is really all the focus is in the vineyard, all the focus is in the winery. All the focus is really, again, in the processing, in the fermentation process. We're looking at aging now, we're looking at racking, returning, we're looking at cap management. All of that really exciting stuff that happens in the vineyard, in the winery, means that the vineyard is taking a rest and it starts to go into that winter dormancy. And the winter dormancy is actually a really, really important part of the life of a vine. If you have a vine that doesn't get to go into true dormancy, it might start producing fruit again too soon. You might get more than one harvest in a year. And this is generally not considered desirable for wine grapes because those grapes start to lose their intensity. They start to become of a lower quality and less and more sort of diluted. This is when you let the sheep run wild in the vineyard and eat the leftover grapes and fertilize. Yes, Nancy. The goats, the sheep, whatever you got, right? This is when you go to natural management of the vineyard, and let the livestock do their thing. But yeah, the fertilization. But the truth of the matter is that in any case, you want to make sure that as a winemaker, and when you're managing your vineyard, you want to ensure that your vine has the opportunity to get that true dormancy, because it is critical for extending the life of the vine as well. The more vintages it produces, essentially, it'll age faster, and you won't necessarily get the same quality out of it harvest after harvest if it's doing more than one a year. So it's very important to remember that. So there we go. That, my friends, is the life cycle of a vine. So that is our grapevine. I hope that that was fun and made some good sense for you guys. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to share them now. I think that, ooh, Venkat, thank you. My goodness, this is a good one. All right, that was awesome. Yes, cutting a vine instead of seeds. Yes, yes, yes. Yes, yes, it can. So I'm sorry, the question is, after planting a cutting, can a vine mutate and change while it's growing? And this is a great question. And yes, it absolutely can. So one of the things that you'll see in a vineyard is that you might, this has happened very recently too in Spain with the Tempranillo grape. So Tempranillo is a red vine. It's a red grape initially, but it has over time turned into a white grape. So there's Tempranillo Blanco in Spain now that just sort of appears in the vineyard. It can just kind of out of nowhere. And the same way Pinot Noir, or Pinot as the varietal itself, is a highly mutable grape, which is why we also have Pinot Gris and Pinot Blanc, all part of the same, and Pinot Noir. So these are all originally started out as just the Pinot grape, but once they started growing, developed differently and matured differently. So they did start to mutate and change during the growth cycle. And then, does its genetic material change throughout the vine? The idea is that if you have a mutated vine, it's the same idea as having a clone. So when I talk about Pinot Noir and Pinot Blanco, for example, right? Those are considered two separate grapes, even though they're both the Pinot grape. But genetically, they don't taste the same, or they don't taste the same, and they have different genetic profiles. That being said, if you like this Pinot Blanc wine and this Pinot Blanc grape, you would take a cutting from that and you would use that to plant another vine that would produce usually the same grape that you already have. So that's why we do the cutting. Even though it has the potential to mutate, let's say the mutation happens, and this is not an official quote, happens 1 out of every 100 vines will change a little bit. In the case of a very dramatic change, it might change from red to white grape. In most cases, each individual vine might have very slight variations. And this mutation, Lael, is it's caused by just nature, right? The same way that if we have nature versus nurture, but just natural selection over time, the development of the grape, that individual vine, whatever nutrients are underneath that particular soil, what its exact environment is, what its particular, how it is absorbing the sun and the water and the nutrients. The idea is that this is just a natural thing that happens. It's natural mutation as the vines grow themselves. So even though it starts off as the original genetic material of another vine and it's 99.9% the same, there is an opportunity for that to change. Yeah, I think so. Okay, great. Anyone got another one? Who's got another one? I should take a sip of wine. I haven't had a single sip of wine. I hope you guys have been drinking while I've been talking. Thank you guys so much. I will see you all, I hope, next week. We're going to talk about soil, which I find to be an absolutely fascinating and endlessly complicated and interesting topic. So thank you all very much. I hope you have a really, really great evening. And I'll see a lot of you, I hope, tomorrow too. Okay. Bye, guys.